Well, David, thank you for that introduction. You know, when I agreed to speak tonight, I understood that being a keynote speaker at a dinner means that you only had to speak longer than your introduction, but it had to be shorter than a sermon. I was also asked whether or not I wanted to use a PowerPoint presentation tonight. And I immediately said no. And the reason being is that I come from an institution where the culture is not to use PowerPoint. Now, that's not because we have some technical shortcomings, but it's because the Department of State actually only has 3 talking points. The first is, I'm from the Department of State, and I'm here to help. The second is, I don't think we should do that. And the third is, I told you so. So, doesn't make for a very, very big slide deck, to say the least. You spend a lot of time at interagency meetings explaining. I'm also frequently asked, what does it mean to become an ambassador? And after my 37 years in the Foreign Service, I realized that it was a very simple answer. Becoming an ambassador means you finally get to use the first person singular. After years of saying, we think, when you write your reports from your overseas postings, you get to say, I believe. You get to say, I believe, because people think you've earned the ability to say something that's credible. I am not the first CMC graduate to be a career Foreign Service officer to become an ambassador. Before I became the U.S. ambassador in the Pacific, responsible for Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, the Kingdom of Tonga, and Tuvalu, as well as all the French territories, I often say I was responsible for 25% of the surface of the earth. Mostly water, but we were at peace. No, the honor of being the first CMC career ambassador goes to the late Larry Rawson, class of 1975. Larry was our ambassador to Croatia. I was also followed by Daniel Johannes, class of 1976, who became our ambassador to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Daniel took what we call the political appointees path. He began his career here in the West, and then through serendipity, found himself appointed an ambassador. We don't hold that against him because he had to spend tough duty in Paris, by the way. But Larry Rawson's story, I believe, is very germane to my comments tonight. As I said, Daniel can tell his own story, but Larry's, I think, is much more important. You know, Larry left Claremont in 1975 to join the Foreign Service right after graduation. He had tough assignments in Mali, South Africa, and a few other interesting places. He and I did not actually catch up until the mid-'80s, when at that time, following assignments in Taiwan and Zaire, I became the desk officer for Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and Larry was at the NSC working on European affairs. Whenever we met, Larry and I talked a great deal about the importance of graduating from CMC and the impact that it had on our careers. For me, I can always say that everything I learned about foreign policy, I learned right here on campus, right here at CMC. My mentor was Ed Haley. Thank you, Greg. And I took every one of Ed's classes. Ed encouraged me. He brought me to the Model UN program in 1972. And he was my reference for joining the Foreign Service, and yes, Cornell. When I was here on campus, to underscore what I mean about learning everything about foreign policy, years later, when I was assigned to the U.S. mission to the United Nations in New York, and I think David mentioned that, I was responsible for drafting and negotiating the Security Council Resolution 1367, that imposed sanctions against the Taliban for harboring Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. I knew that resolution, drafted under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, would have the impact of domestic law. I knew that because Ward Elliott taught me in his constitutional law class that actions ratified by international treaties have the power of domestic law. While here on campus, I took a class on nuclear policy, and I read Kissinger's book, and one thing that always stood out from that book was that the complete security of one nation means the incomplete security of another. That held me in good stead when I was working on Pakistan issues. And I dare say that everyone in Washington now who's engaged in nuclear issues has read Kissinger's book. Well, almost everyone. But notwithstanding that, my time at CMC prepared me for actually working through 6 administrations and a whole raft of assignments. I was well prepared to make contributions in a world that was largely defined by bipolar competition, the vestiges of post-colonial struggles, and marked the rise of small states. However, we're now in a period in which the United States is not getting weaker, but other countries, adversaries, and allies are getting stronger, notably China. But let's not omit countries like India, Brazil, Nigeria, and Indonesia, just to name a few. We're witnessing the steady proliferation of nuclear states or nuclear-capable states that have become potential threats. And of course, we're all familiar with DPRK and Iran, and I mentioned earlier, Pakistan. We also have the challenge of dealing with non-state actors. So, in preparation for tonight's remarks, I thought, let me look at something else beside engaging in punditry to talk about where we are. And I turned to the assessments of the National Intelligence Council, which did a good study on what the challenges we will face between 2017 and 2035. So let me take a time to just read the highlights. The first challenge that has implications for global trends are the rich are aging and the poor are not. The global economy is shifting. Weak economic growth will persist in the near term. Technology is accelerating progress but causing dislocations. Ideas and identities are driving a wave of exclusion. Governing is getting harder. The nature of conflict is changing. Climate change, environment, and health issues will demand attention. These are the challenges that all of us will face as trustees, as faculty, as administrators, as students, and as alumni. And we're going to have to come up with ways to address these challenges. One of the things that's important about being here at CMC is that we've always risen to these challenges. Decisions that we make today will have great impact on what we do tomorrow. One of the most significant decisions that we made as a college was the admission of women to Claremont Men's College. Now, why am I remarking upon that right now? Well, let's talk a little bit about what CMC women do. They're the majority of our government and other majors. Since 1983, when we were taking tabs of this, 51% of the students who have gone to the Washington program have been women. This means that if we look at the metrics, what happened in my era, in which Larry Rawson, Daniel Johannes, a handful of other CMCers went to Washington to pursue careers, our successors since the mid-'80s in leadership roles will be the women of CMC. I must say that that means that Smith and Wellesley better watch out. But more important, because of that fact, when I first came back to campus at the urging of Dean Peter Ulven, he asked me to take a look at what are some of the things I would like to talk about. I decided that, given those stats, the first thing that I would talk about would be the issue of women, peace, and security. It became clear to me that this was important for all of us, but particularly important for our CMC women. And so actually my first speech here at the ATH was on that subject. I also chose that subject because the Claremont International Relations Society is largely run by CMC women. And you always need a constituency, by the way, as well as strong faculty support by Jenny Tarr. And I look to them to not only build upon my first lecture, but we had an ongoing film series on women, peace, and security that year. Why is this important? It's important because last week, Congress passed the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017. This bipartisan legislation tasked the president with ensuring through all federal agencies the means to promote meaningful participation of women in all aspects of overseas conflict prevention, management, and resolution through a variety of diplomatic efforts and programs. The president is tasked to report annually to Congress his efforts in achieving this goal. For those of you who are keeping score, I'd like to point out that the issue of women, peace, and security was first raised in an executive order by President Obama. And today, this legislation passed by a voice vote by a Republican Congress can only be stopped by one vote. We know whose vote that is. I doubt it'll happen. But our task is to ensure that CMC women and students will be at the table in the future to deal with these issues. And since I've been working here with students, I've witnessed in Washington and on campus a strong desire by our students to have a practitioner's experience to complement their academic work. As a result, and with the support of Min Shin Pei and the Keck Center, we brought to campus the Center for Applied Strategic Learning of the National Defense University to work on a series of exercises that are normally reserved for senior military officers, government officials, and members of Congress on national security responses. I have to say that I was inspired to bring the National Defense University to campus because during my first year as an alumnus trustee, and I was at the graduation ceremony for our ROTC program, I recall David Head saying, "You belong to us, and we're going to do everything we can to support you." So I remember that, David. So our ROTC students are an important part of this exercise. The first exercise we brought on campus was how we respond to a global influenza pandemic. This November, we're going to be doing it again. And we're going to be doing it again, not only supported by the Keck Center, but with my wingman, Trustee Fred Prager, who participated in the first one and will participate in the second one. In this exercise, we'll focus on the situation in Syria. So we have to keep doing things to support this notion by our students to have a practitioner's eye. I've been fortunate enough to mentor CMC students interested in the Foreign Service. I've seen in just recent years, Dante Topo, class of 15, just this summer, was sworn in as a Foreign Service officer, the first CMC grad to enter the Department of State under the State Department's Pickering Fellowship Program. Dylan Huey, class of 17, is right behind him as a Pickering Fellow. Tiana Pugh, class of 18, is going to be joining, or is rather slated to join, the State Department's Rangel Fellowship Program. She was chosen last year for the Rangel Summer Program. These prestigious programs allow the State Department to pay for graduate school leading to a career in foreign service. I'd like to note that CMC students have been successful in applying to these programs because of the tireless work of Brian Davison, who parks over there in a little office where nobody knows where he is. But he's been doing great work. But him doing great work is part of what we have to do as the CMC family to continue to promote our active participation in solving the foreign policy challenges of the coming years. I mentioned just the 2035 because we're all going to be here. So we're all going to have to make a decision what we're going to do to affect that. But we can't do it alone. Here on campus, we have all of the components necessary to prepare, plan, and promote CMC alumni for their future roles as national leaders in the public and in the private sector. I mentioned we have the Keck Center. We have the Kravitz Leadership Institute, the Dreyer Roundtable, the Saul Center. Taking notes, Bruce, I told you, all right. We have the Mgrublian Center for Human Rights. And probably in the short period of time I have to speak, some that I'm omitting. But I think it's important now to do something together. So I believe the time is right to look at ways in which all of these components can work together to strengthen the CMC Washington program. This is not a criticism of the program. I've met with Elizabeth Spaulding a number of times. I mentioned Fred's my wingman on the exercises. I'm Elizabeth's wingman on the Washington program. You know, looking backwards, I understand the important role that serendipity can play in developing your career. But I also know that there can be a significant impact with a comprehensive, cohesive, and coordinated framework. We can build that framework for our students. I'm hopeful that my comments tonight can contribute to a discussion amongst the trustees in particular, as well as faculty, administrators, students, and alumni on how we can nurture, foster, and enhance CMC's role in developing a strong foreign policy future for our country. As I said before, over the past 4 decades, I only have one really main talking point, and that is, I'm from the State Department, and I'm here to help. So I hope my contributions tonight have helped.